Thank you for listening to the Speaking Out on Sex Abuse podcast with hosts Clara and Jimmy Hinton. If you're new to the podcast, please look us up on your favorite podcast app, subscribe, like, and share so that you never miss an episode. If you'd like to further support us, visit patreon.com/speakingout and check out the different rewards. You'll find exclusive rewards if you sign up as a patron of the podcast. Thank you for your support, and let's get into the show. Thank you for tuning in to this episode. We are glad that our patrons are with us and support us. And today we have a very special guest. We have with us Chele Roland. So Chele, hello.
Hello, Jimmy.
So hang on to your seats here, listeners, because Chele was the whistleblower for the International Churches of Christ. And if you don't know who they are, they're also known as the Boston Movement, and kind of a branch of our tribe, the Churches of Christ. So we have a lot of the same roots, and there was just a lot of corruption and cultish behavior, sexual abuse, spiritual abuse. And after many years, Chele kind of had enough. And so you took initiative, and we're so glad that you're with us today. And I think your story is going to be really helpful for a lot of people who might be in a similar situation and that they're just ready to find out what the next steps are.
Nice.
Yeah.
And let's throw in there as well that there is another branch of the International Churches of Christ, which uses the moniker, ICOC. If you were to look up the ICOC, it will auto-populate quite a few things in your Google search. But the branch of the ICOC with the original founder is the ICC, the International Church. What does he call that? The International
Churches of Christ, right?
Right, but then it's the International Christian Church is the ICC.
Yeah.
Which is the founder, Kip McKean, his new group, when he was pushed out of the ICOC for different abuses, right?
Yeah, isn't that amazing that people they scrub, they relabel, rebrand, and go right back at it again?
Well, interestingly enough, though, so did the ICOC. So when they pushed Kip out, quite a few of those churches or different cities, to not fall under scrutiny of how they have lived and treated their people, they would change the name. For example, the San Antonio ICOC then became Mission Point Church.
Oh.
Or you see what I'm saying? And
Gotcha.
Then in Las Vegas, which used to be the Las Vegas ICOC, they are now Valley Christian. You've got one in Virginia that goes by Hampton Roads Church. So they, you got to know you're doing something wrong when you need to rebrand so people don't connect you to the mothership, right? But yet still wanted anything that was beneficial from being under that umbrella, they would still claim, whether it's Hope Worldwide, the supposedly charitable arm, or the fellowship, the larger fellowship. We're a part of a fellowship of 118,000 people. All of a sudden, they are a part of the ICOC, or when they need something from them.
That's right? A really good point. Yeah.
They are conveniently associated when it's mutually beneficial. But when something bad comes down the pike, like these lawsuits that we'll get into, all of a sudden they're like, wait, we're not connected.
Well, we saw that with the Southern Baptist Convention did the same thing because they claimed autonomy when it comes to sexual abuse, and so they said, well, these churches are autonomous, and so we as a governing board don't really have control over policy. But then when it comes to issues like women preaching, all of a sudden that's a huge issue, and they can make a sweeping policy.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and another interesting fact there, that just recently happened when the Portland ICOC said, well, we would like to talk about complementarianism right? Where women complement the man but are not equal to.
Yeah.
And so they really dug their heels in, a couple that used to be pretty big leaders in the ICOC. So that whole group in Portland was disfellowshipped, right?
Yeah.
For their views on, hey, let's revisit women's roles in the church.
Yeah. So that's interesting too, because they have the power to blacklist individual churches or groups of churches. And so you're right. When it benefits
Yes.
them, all of a sudden we're part of the brotherhood, you know?
Right. We all hold the same beliefs with the same common goal.
Yeah.
Right. All of that. But when there's sexual abuse or abuse, whoa, we're autonomous.
Yeah.
We are not connected, not our problem.
Yes. Yeah. You see that pattern emerge pretty clearly after a while.
Right.
So,
I mean, Jimmy, but here's the deal, Jimmy. There truly is nothing new under the sun.
No.
Right? It's like whatever formula works, they're going to try to push that.
Yes.
Right? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Oh, for sure. Yeah. And it boils down to, in my opinion, what I've seen, it really boils down to personalities. You have domineering personalities who, at the end of the day, people may not like them, and they may be turned off by them. But somehow they still, those loud voices went out. And even if it's not individuals like within the churches of Christ, it'll be certain universities that went out. So,
right.
like Pepperdine's the black sheep, and, Harding and Lipscomb are kind of like the mother hens, but now Lipscomb's just getting a little bit too, a little too liberal. And so some of those churches are shunned. And so you get these weird divisions among supposed autonomous churches.
Yeah.
And people migrate to the universities or organizations that have the most clout for that time.
Yes. And interesting, that also goes along with the ICOC groups around the country that had hotbeds of sexual abuse. Some leaders were more tolerant, more let's push it to the side. For example, I'm going to use San Antonio again because it's been a hotbed. One of the defendants listed in that lawsuit is a teacher at Lubbock University. Teaching students. Has Lubbock done anything? And the president is aware of the lawsuits at the university. They have done nothing. Yeah, sure. Terrifying, frightening. Yeah. And this guy has multiple accusers.
Yeah, it really is. Well, I want to say to our listeners too, they might notice an absent seat here. So Granny did not get fired. She is dealing with a house issue today, that an emergency that came up. So that's where she is. But I want to ask you, Chele, being a whistleblower, what prompted you to organize what are now multiple lawsuits, and it sounds like more to come, and to be reaching out to other victims? What prompted you to do that? What was that turning point where you're like, okay, now's the time?
Right. Well, I like to summarize it in an abbreviation or an acronym called PDP, Podcast Discovery Phenomenon, which is what I call it. I keep telling myself I'm going to copyright that statement because I think it's going to catch on.
You need to.
If you notice, right, there's podcasts all over the country that are literally solving crimes. So I was doing this little podcast with another pretty famous cult survivor, we will call him, Hoyt Richards. And we weren't focused on the ICOC, but we talked about it quite a bit because that's my story, right? And what happened to me. So had so many people starting to call in and reach out to me on their own saying, hey, I was sexually abused in this group. Why are you not talking about that? So that started to obviously get my attention, but it pretty much shell shocked me in the sense of I literally thought, well, at least we didn't have a lot of sexual abuse in the ICOC. I knew there was some, and I'll get to that in a second, because we'd heard rumors or heard stories, but it was so quickly shoved under the rug, or the victim was so quickly vilified, right? That we all just bought into that pretty quickly. It was too hard to think otherwise.
Sure.
It was too hard to believe it. But with me, my story, my brainwashing, my indoctrination was so thick that even though I had been sexually abused inside of the ICOC, and I'll explain that more in a sec, I thought I was an anomaly. I had really bought into the fact that it was my fault and that I was not going to besmirch the group at the time with my story. And quite frankly, I was always getting in trouble and I was getting rebuked all the time. And there was so much daily trauma and daily psychological abuse and mental abuse and emotional abuse and sleep deprivation. And you're in this hamster wheel of trauma and pain and expectations, right? And there's so the burdens on your shoulders are so heavy that you literally can't think straight. So in my scenario, there was this guy that they were trying to recruit, this man that came to church because he liked me. And so basically I was at the time what the person called spiritual bait to bring this gentleman in, right? And again, remember, everything's about numbers. Numbers. We need to hit our predictions. We predicted that our group was going to baptize 5 people this week. You know, come hell or high water, we are baptizing 5 people. So with me, it was, hey, this guy really likes you. Shell, why don't you maybe show him some of your favorite scriptures? I think was what the suggestion was. So we had set up a coffee meeting for me to share my favorite scriptures with him to get him sucked in, right?
Yeah.
Because you can only date people that are members. So it's made very clear to this person that he could not date me unless he was a member. So that was keeping him involved. So we set up a coffee appointment, not a coffee date, appointment. It was very clearly an appointment. I looked back through my journals and I have appointment highlighted to remind myself, right? My journals are basically like a crime map, by the way.
Yeah.
Literally, it's like, you know, the big whiteboards in the CIA where you're connecting all the dots. That's my journals, right? In my journals, I'm like, let me show you how this happened. So anyway, so I invite him over and he says, oh, can I use your restroom really quick? I say, sure. He sets himself on the couch afterwards and says, hey, I'm in a hurry. Why don't we just have tea here? Can you make me some hot tea? And I'm like, oh, sure. Let's, you know, it's broad daylight. Sure.
Yeah.
So I'm making the tea. I went to my room and I'll fast forward this part. But he ends up dragging me into my room and violently raping me.
Wow.
So much so that I had bruises on my neck. But what's so interesting, Jimmy, is after it happened, I was almost catatonic. Like I went into robot mode and I went into damage control mode. Like they had trained me so well that I was like, okay, this is how this is going to happen. This is what I'm going to say. This is what, and I even wrote it down. Like, this is here's what we're going to do. Here's how we're going to, you know, cover this up. And one of my biggest thoughts was, I'll be rebuked. I'll be blamed. The few people that did talk about things like that happening were so squashed. They were taken out of leadership. They were told they just had to forgive. They were reminded how it was their fault. I mean, just the classic, what were you wearing? We told you those skirts were too short. You don't listen. You're disobedient. This is God trying to get your attention. I mean, you name it.
Yeah.
It was told to them. And then they were
crazy,
kind of shunned and cast aside. And and literally called damaged goods. And so it was so blatant and so clear, and just, it was very palpable to me. I knew what they would do because they told me, don't spend time alone with him. So in my mind, I'm thinking, they told me not to do this. Although it was innocent, it was, hey, can I use your restroom? But I felt like it was my fault.
Yeah.
So eventually a roommate knew because she saw the bruises and I broke down. It's probably about maybe 5 days later, right around there when the bruises started showing. I'd have to look in my journal to see how long it was. But, and again, I was in, let me cover this up mode. We literally got tattoo makeup to cover up the bruises. And I wore a turtleneck, and I was about to get married as well. So,
wow.
Someone that I didn't like, but
yeah,
you don't marry who you like, or at least I didn't marry who I liked in the ICOC. It was what I call marriage trafficking, where you find the only person available, because they are building ministry couples, and there's a definite formula there. Sure. So I was married another ministry person, and I just completely blocked it all out, hardened my heart to the whole thing, and went back to life as we know it. My body remembered. I mean, the PTSD and the anxiety kicked in, but they would just always accuse me of having secret sin, not being open, being rebellious, being disobedient. I was always getting in trouble. I was always accused of, things, mostly anxiety, and that being a weakness or a lack of spirituality.
Yeah, I was going to say lack of faith. Yeah.
Lack of faith, lack of spirituality. But in my mind, remember, I'm indoctrinated. So that tracks for me. I'm like, they're right. I do have secret sin. I didn't listen. This happened, right? So I did feel like damaged goods. So the narrative those tapes played in my head quite often. Now, I think it was about a year later, I did end up we were moved to another city to lead there. Mind you, in the years that I was in the church, and then in the couple of years that I was recovering when I finally left, I moved 30 times total. I was only in the ICOC, I was in the ICOC for 17 years. So you move 30 times.
Wow.
There's no normalcy there. There's no time to settle. There's no time to figure yourself out or even think about how you feel. You're just constantly moving, right?
Yeah.
So there was a lot of beginnings and endings, but no middles. No settling, no finding yourself. So
did they tell you, like they told you where to move?
Oh, yeah. Because I was in the full-time ministry.
Yeah.
I was paid by the group.
Yeah.
So they tell you where you're going next. It's like the military.
Sure. Yeah.
There's a need here.
Only
you're
worse.
Oh my gosh, I would have rather have been in the military. Trust me. At least then I would have learned some skills, right? Or got a degree or something. Something marketable. That is
I didn't mean that worse as in the military is bad. It's not. Like I love the military.
Right. I think I would have loved it.
But I mean the moving around part, that's hard on families. But yeah, when you're told you have to do it and there's no real clear purpose, that'd be tough.
Well, the purpose was this group needs strengthening, or they need leaders, and you guys would be perfect for it. So you were moved around. But if you went to a group that wasn't in a nice city or as cool, it was punishment because you weren't performing in the nice city in Orange County, where all the rich, beautiful white people are.
Yeah.
So now we're demoting you to East LA. Right? So we got moved to the East region. It was definitely a demotion. And the leader there, I really trusted. And he was kind of a rebel like me. Like he would buck the current a little bit. And I'm like, I like this guy, right? He's a little maverick like me. And so in one moment, he was telling me some very hard personal things from his childhood. And I don't know what happened. I just blurted it out. Right.
Mm-hmm.
And the most bizarre thing, Jimmy, is we had a retreat in Big Bear that weekend for all the leaders. So we had a Christmas retreat. We went up there, and I think it was within like one day of being there, this man went out to his car and never came back. Come to find out, he'd driven back down the hill, back down from Big Bear to his home, cleared his house out, so it was all pre-planned, and disappeared.
Wow.
He was what the ICOC called falling away from God. So how bad does it have to be where you disappear into like almost like a witness protection program?
I was going to say that's exactly what it's like.
He was just gone. Like the house was empty.
Wow.
So he'd had it so pre-planned. Of course, his wife was devastated. She didn't know.
Mm-hmm.
So even she was in the dark, and it turned into this big thing. And in my indoctrinated mind, I thought, see, you shouldn't be telling people this. You probably pushed him over the edge. He didn't know what to do. And that was not true. And that had nothing to do, come to find out, with his decision. He had already made that.
Yeah.
But for him, he was probably like, good God, I'm out of here. So, probably played into his narrative. So anyways, after that, I just never talked about it. Fast forward to about 6 months ago, when I start hearing all these stories. I don't think it's by any coincidence that God had these stories coming to me. I think it was divine. I think this charge is being led by God himself. Yes. What are the chances that these stories are funneling through me, right? Mm-hmm. And first of all, I think God was probably like, first of all, girl, you got to start talking, right? And you got to get some help, because how are you going to help these other humans tell their own story, find their own voice when you're not telling yours?
Yeah.
So in one of the podcasts that I do, that when we first started hearing the stories, I literally say on the podcast, my sexual abuse wasn't from the ICOC. I say I didn't have sexual abuse inside the OC, meaning it wasn't by a member.
Mm-hmm.
So I thought mine didn't count.
Yeah.
I mean, that's where my brain was at. I don't count. My story doesn't count because it wasn't by a member. So I didn't think it really fit.
Right.
It wasn't until I was talking to Senator Joe Dunn in passing, telling him my story. And he was like, whoa, hold up. Stop. What? Tell me that again. And I told him the whole thing. And he was like, Chele, wake up. They fostered this environment. This would have never had happened to you if you weren't trying to convert this guy for them.
Right.
You were following what they said to do. It was on their turf. You were in the full-time ministry. Yes, you matter. This counts.
Yes.
So that's when I decided to be a Jane Doe 1. And in the lawsuits, when you read through them, I am Jane Doe 1. But it took a lot of, I really had to meditate and pray through that, because since I was kind of the whistleblower, right, and the one kind of marching down this path for all of the survivors, I didn't want it to seem like I had an axe to grind, or that I was bitter, like they say all the time, or that I was unforgiving, or all these other things that I have challenged this group on over the years.
Yeah.
Right? Because I haven't been quiet about other things, the other types of abuses, the financial abuse. I've sent 63 emails over the last 10 years to different leaders around the country of the ICOC. Not one of them would sit down with me with a Bible on their turf to help me understand why some of these abuses are still continuing. Refused. And would say, you just need to forgive. You're bitter, move on with your life. So had they given me that chance, I could have told them the rest of this, but they wouldn't listen.
Well, I found this, like, I'm in such a weird position because I'm a church leader.
Yes.
I had reported my own dad without hesitation,
Right.
zero hesitation. And Mom and I talk about this, like, we did not see any other option. There was no other option in our mind. We weren't like, well, let's talk to him and hear his side of the story. Like, there was no other option. Our option was that we saw in front of us, report it, and deal with whatever comes next. Figure it out. And so as a church leader who took those steps, I try to figure out what is it in other church leaders, like the majority of church leaders that take that approach where they don't want to talk about it. They want to tell you, forgive and move on. And when I say I'm non-confrontational, like, I am really non-confrontational. I've always been very non-confrontational. But then I see the pattern of these church leaders who shut real victims and survivors down, and they're the polar opposite. Like, they thrive on confrontation. And so,
Right.
you know what I mean? So why is it that they have no problem bossing people around, telling them what to do, what they have to do, what they can't do? But when they're challenged even a little bit, their response is, don't want to talk about it. Wait a second. Your whole personality revolves around confrontation. You love to get into these full-blown fights with people. Like,
Right.
they thrive on it,
Right.
And so I always try to figure that out. And to me, I guess the best conclusion I can come up with is that it's this major sign of weakness that little people are bullies, and they're spiritual bullies, plain and simple. They're authoritarian. They come up with all these fabricated Bible verses that all authority, goes to the church elders or whatever. And I'm like, yeah, no, that's kind of the polar opposite if you actually read your Bible, like, polar opposite.
Right. Right.
And so I think it really, really boils down to when they feel challenged or that they have to deal with a challenging issue where they actually have to think and process and come up with logical answers. They don't know what to do with that. And so their response is, well, Chele, that you don't dare challenge church elders or a minister or whatever. Like, we're a person of authority.
Especially as a woman.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Especially as a woman.
Yeah. And so I think that's how that whole cycle, which is so toxic and cultic, how it just keeps getting perpetrated. It's like this endless cycle of these very confrontational people who all of a sudden say, well, Chele, just take the high road. Well, wait a second. These people never take the high road. You know what I mean? Like, ever.
Yeah. Right.
And so it's so ironic and hypocritical that all of a sudden they're like, well, you just take the high road, just forgive and offer grace. And I often think, like, sometimes survivors have to take a step back and be like, wait, like, the same grace that you gave me when you berated me, when you shamed me, when you told me that, whatever it is, like, it's just the constant verbal and spiritual abuse. It's constant.
It's constant. But what the ICOC has done with that is taken it even a step further. And one of their main narratives now is, but we've changed.
Yeah.
Right. So now you're battling through not only you need to forgive, you need to move on. You sound like you're still a little bit bitter. This is what happens when you leave God, because to them I've left God, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And then they say, and we've changed. It's not that bad anymore. So they'll acknowledge how bad it was, because you can't avoid the massive bleeding they had, first of all, of people leaving.
Sure.
And all the people that have defected since 1980. They've got about 2 million defectors, is my guess.
Wow.
So you've got all these people talking. So the only narrative they can hold to is, but we've changed. Okay, but if you've changed, why did 63 people not sit down with me with a Bible. Not one of you.
Right.
Right. So if you've changed and you've now got hundreds of credible abuse victims raising their hands with some of the most hideous stories you've ever heard of systemic long-term abuse, and you all were in those meetings when the abusers came to you, the elders, the board members, the ministry leader. Well, one of the ministry leaders was one of the abusers.
Mm-hmm.
So we came to you, right? Told you our story. And I'm going to go back to the San Antonio example because they outcried for 17 years, past and present. If you've changed, why did you stand on stage at your Sunday service and read a statement that they are categorically false, the victims, and that they are liars and that they just want money? If you've changed and you are well aware of the abuse, why would you do that? So the reason they're doing it now still, Jimmy, is to protect their reputations, their egos, their organization, and ultimately the paid members, their paychecks.
Yes.
That's why a lot of them are doing it. But even one step further, and you'll know this because of your experience with your dad who went to jail, correct?
Right.
For life.
Yeah. Life sentence.
A life sentence for abusing children, right? Sexually abusing children over a long period of time, serial abuser. What you have now, I think, with them is fear in the ICOC because failure to report is a crime.
Yes.
It's what got a lot of the Southern Baptists that went to jail. Especially if you're a mandatory reporter, that's a crime. So now I think what I'm seeing is they're like, oh, wait, hold up. We knew this and we didn't report it. So now they have to feign in their church-wide response. They said, we are shocked and appalled.
Yeah.
We didn't know. Yeah, you did.
So do you have all the letters that you sent to these 63 leaders?
The emails?
Yeah.
Yes. It was a 13-page document listing out my whole story.
So it's pretty hard to deny that they didn't know.
Well, mine was about other abuses.
Okay. Yeah.
For me personally, in the 63. Now, I planned on telling them the whole thing if someone would sit down with me. I wasn't going to put that in an email.
Sure.
For a million reasons. I don't trust them, what they would do with it. But I thought the first person that sits down with me, I'm going to tell them. I didn't have the chance.
Yeah.
They wouldn't. So, but with these other survivors, there's emails. They outcried to Hope Worldwide, our charitable arm, who has one of their offshoots at one time was called Hope for Kids. So you've got sexual abuse victims crying out to the leaders of Hope in emails, right? Emails, evidence. Not one person from Hope responded to them.
Wow.
And they both typed up their story saying, why won't anyone help us? And why are two of our abusers who are in the same family, why are they overseeing churches? We've been telling you guys this for years. And one of the abusers in San Antonio is set to lead the church there. Like he's, last I heard. So who knows what they'll do with that. But so that's a very long answer to your question. But I think now why they're responding that way is pretty layered. Like I said, you take we've changed, and they don't want to look like they haven't changed, right?
Yep.
That was a long time ago. You need to forgive. These girls just want money. But I think there's also fear laced in there because of the failure to report.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and as they're finding out now, there's also financial liability that comes with not reporting. It's not just it's like individually too, because these lawsuits are not just against the organization, they're against individuals as well.
Right.
And I think that's really important for people to realize. Like when I was consulting with churches, I would repeatedly tell them, like, you guys are on the hook for this. If you don't report,
Yeah.
you personally are on the hook for that. Your organization is on the hook for that. Your reputation, the church's reputation, is on the hook for that, and you personally are on the hook for that. So
Right.
you really want to play with that fire. Like,
Yeah.
that's not really something I would want to mess around with. But like, even that aside, Mom and I we never even thought about that kind of stuff. We weren't like, oh my goodness, we could be sued if we don't report. Like, for us, it was like, what else do you do with that information? You
Right.
know, like, when you're given that information, you turn it over to the police and let them investigate it and let them find out
Right.
what the facts are. Let them find out.
Well, but in the ICOC, because they haven't done that for so many years, so many of these perpetrators and pedophiles were let loose to go abuse other people.
Sure.
So the level of depravity there
Yeah.
is what's shocking and appalling.
Well, that was another question that I want to ask too, because
Yeah.
the ICOC was reported. They were reported on. I didn't find this out until this past week. They were reported on dating back to 1993. 2020 did a report on how churches do. They did a report on the abuses within the church, and then
Yeah.
since 2020 aired that in 1993. Like, think about that.
Yeah, I know.
This goes back a long time. Since then, many more victims were produced by these same abusers that 2020 did a story on. And
Mm-hmm.
we know how churches do damage control. If the media look like they're a bunch of hounds and they're just, they're out for a pound of flesh kind of thing. Do you think that these lawsuits will be different for the ICOC and ICC this time? And in other words, are you hopeful that the church will finally not be able to cover up abuse? And why or why?
Yes, very, very. Several things. I describe what happened in the 90s because I was a part of the group then, right? A
Mm-hmm.
leader in Los Angeles, the nerve center or control panel, if you will.
Yeah.
Where our maniacal leader, Kip McKean, was stationed, right?
Mm-hmm.
At his control panel, pulling all the strings like a puppet master. But when these 2020 Barbara Walters, Inside Edition, Fox News, when these stories would come out in prime time, we would play them on a gigantic screen and do a congregational meeting. So I remember one down at the Biltmore Hotel in Los Angeles where it was played on a screen and Kip was beaming with pride, just, Cheshire grin on a cat,
Mm-hmm.
just. So what he could do was really bring the congregation, the members, to this fever pitch of, we are changing the world. Everybody's listening. We're going to use this to our advantage. We're going to use it to evangelize. And we are being persecuted just like Jesus
I was gonna
was.
say, yep, that's how they frame it. We're being
Yes,
persecuted for our faith.
it's
Look at the false
persecuted.
accusations.
And it proves us worthy. It proves us authentic. How can we change the world without persecution? If we're not persecuted, we're doing something wrong.
Wow.
And people would just buy into that. It literally was a fever pitch.
Yeah.
Right. And so here's how I describe that, though, and what's different now. Because Kip is still doing that with his new group, the ICC, right?
Yeah.
That is his shtick, his narrative is, we are being persecuted and it's going to help us evangelize the world. You should embrace it, right? Jesus's disciples, apostles were thrown into jail, dragged into court. Get ready. And you can hear the crowd, come on, bro. Like, you see the videos online.
Yeah.
It's fascinating, actually. Sad, but fascinating.
Yeah, it is.
So, but here's the difference. Here's what I think the difference is. In the 90s, we didn't have social media like we do now.
Mm-hmm.
We didn't have the internet like we do now. So when you saw something on TV, eventually that would just kind of trickle away. you
Yeah,
know,
you could
our
really
kids,
isolate that. Yeah, you could isolate that to an individual
right,
congregation or group of people. Yeah,
and mobilize it.
yeah.
But now what's happening, and I explain it, and tell me if this makes sense, Jimmy, like an antibiotic. When you have an infection, a bacterial infection, you get a round of antibiotics, right? And
Mm-hmm.
they tell you, you have to take these antibiotics for the whole week. If you take one or two, the bacteria can figure that antibiotic out, rise above it. It won't be effective. And then the infection gets worse.
Yeah.
It's empowered because it won the war against the antibiotic. In the 2020, the Inside Edition, those were like the first round of an antibiotic. But
Mm.
because it didn't keep going, it wasn't round after round, punch after punch after punch, right?
Yeah.
So eventually the ICOC figured and conquered that couple shows that came out and went on to be stronger, I would say.
And morphed into another disease, the
And morphed it,
ICC,
right.
right?
Great
Yeah.
point. Eventually morphed into another infection on
Yeah.
society. So what's different now is that social media has caught on, the media in general has caught on,
Hmm.
and we have started filming our docu-series, which will be global, with thousands of people that want to be involved. So it's that docu-series, I believe, will be like a vaccination, if
Yeah.
you will, an immunization to really get it into as many homes as possible around the world, that this is what these people do, this is how they work, and all of the people in the docu-series are examples of the carnage and the shrapnel of what has happened to their lives for buying into that lie about who God is and what he expects from you, and
Hmm.
how you have to live to be saved.
Yeah.
All funneled through really one man, Kip McKean.
Yeah.
So in the ICOC, they say, but Kip's gone, ding dong, the witch is dead, the Wizard of
Hmm. Yeah.
Oz. Right? So now it's just a beautiful land of disciples at the ICOC. No, sir, it's not. Evidenced by their response to these souls that have been destroyed by the way they've covered all of this up and continue to try to cover it up.
Sure.
There's been countless suicides. The ICOC, one of their leaders, ministry leaders, last week, unfortunately, had a child that committed suicide.
Mm.
It's like, when are you guys going to get it?
Right.
You're killing people, literally,
Sure.
spiritually, physically, financially, psychologically, mentally, and in some cases, sexually.
Yeah.
So your excuse of we've changed, you haven't, and nobody buys it. And quite frankly, you can't pour new wine into old wineskins. You can't do it.
Yeah. Well, I think the lawsuits too are another layer to that
Right.
immunization, because
Yes.
it does a couple things. One, it puts very real facts on permanent record. I mean, that
Public
stuff is,
record.
yeah, public record and permanent record. So,
Yes.
now people can begin to see, oh my goodness, like here are the facts, like here's what happened, and they don't have a way to defend this.
Correct.
And people can read that. And I think
Right.
that's going to be really important too. How many lawsuits are there right now? And how many victims in the lawsuits?
Let me share one quick thing before that, and then I'll give you
Sure.
those stats. Something interesting about what you just said, that now it's public record and it's written down and people can, permanently refer back to it. One of the ICOC's first kind of lines of defense, our defense mechanisms when the lawsuits came out, was that they were poorly written, lots of grammatical errors, and there's holes in the story.
Mm-hmm.
No mention of the plaintiff's statements, but
Right.
just the way the law team put the general opening narrative together in the lawsuit, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which was simply because we had about a 2-day deadline before December 31st to get the lawsuits filed.
Yeah.
because of the statute of limitations. So it was kind of an all hands on deck situation.
Yeah.
Literally working throughout the night, and the day before New Year's Eve through Christmas, the lead attorney was his whole team was coming together to try to put that together. So there was no one checking the grammar,
Right.
Proofreading. It was like, we got to get this filed and then we'll amend it later.
Sure.
But how interesting that they're so arrogant that they don't talk about these horrific plaintiff stories. They're like, well, this sentence is full of grammar errors.
Well, and I think a lot of that's because of our tribe's background of being very very educated. Like going back to the early restoration movement, like I study restoration history, and at Alexander Campbell at Bethany College in West Virginia. So it was a requirement for people to be just a deacon, to be a deacon of the church. You had to have, I think it was all 4 gospels had to be memorized in Koine Greek.
Wow.
Or like that was the first requirement. And so, we come from a long history of very deep intellect, like really smart people.
That's a great point.
And I think, because they put so much emphasis on the Bible and the, the inerrant Bible and the Bible only and all that stuff, that they mock grammatical errors. Like Alexander Campbell did it. Like he's actually quoted making fun of Joseph Smith whenever he had this revelation from God, and he said, God sure has a lot of grammatical errors. So, this dates back to the mid 1800s, where they would pick on people because they're like, if you really were a student of the Bible, like if you really were knowledgeable, then the first thing you would do is have good grammar, And so I think that's what that dates back to historically. They may not know that, but I think that's kind of the background of that. We have a long history of being so dedicated to education and to being students of the Bible and getting everything right down to grammar. You know? And so in their minds, I'm sure they were thinking like, these people who are bringing the lawsuits, like, we don't have anything to worry about. Like, I think that probably was their initial thought until they woke up and realized like, this is actually pretty serious. But I think their first thought was probably like part of denial and part arrogance and pride. Like, we don't have anything to worry about. These people can't even put 2 sentences together.
Ding, ding, ding. That's pretty spot on. That's pretty spot on. Yeah. They were saying things like, well, we don't really think these are going to stick. They can't even put the complaint together properly.
That's right.
And the attorneys, who are amazing, are the least egotistical. They're like, that's fine. Don't worry. We'll get the next one's perfectly grammatic. It'll be perfect. Right? Like, I mean, isn't it the epitome of you strain a gnat and swallow a camel?
Yes.
I mean, hello, ICOC. Right. There you go. They're swallowing a lot of camels.
Yeah.
So, okay. So back to your question. We've taken in over 1,200 phone calls of abuse since November. There's more. I haven't even got to them all yet. Quite a few of these calls have to funnel through me just because, the law team's doing the law things, right? Sure. And we can't bog them down. And because I've been through it, really no one else can do what I'm doing. Right. And I have brought in other ex-ICOC people to help, and that's, making a tremendous difference. So we've had that many phone calls. We have at least 100 more cases to file.
Wow.
That are fileable, and more coming in. And that the hardest part, Jimmy, is having someone call in with really horrific, either physical abuse or financial destruction, right? I mean, totally financially devastated, and a lot of illegal things done to them. It's so hard to say, well, that's not what our cases are about. We're doing only sexual abuse, because their stories are, for them, just as damaging and destructive, and So it's
Sure.
really, that's the hardest part for me, is listening without really a solution for them
Mm-hmm.
outside of just listening.
Yeah.
So it's tough. It's
Yeah.
definitely challenging. So um, those cases will all be filed. I think what the law team's doing now is they're just working through some jurisdiction issues and really taking deeper dives into what we're doing from here from a legal strategy.
Mm-hmm.
And that's all I can say about that. But um, the goal is to allow people to tell their stories and have their voices heard. That's the main goal. So I think for that, we already feel very great about, in the sense of none of these plaintiffs want money. Some of them won't even accept it. They're like, that's not why I'm doing this. Some said, I won't even do this if there's financial restitution. That's not why I'm doing this.
And
So
we
they
saw
just,
that with, so we saw that with the Pennsylvania grand jury investigation into the Catholic Church,
really,
because like a host of the survivors said, we're not looking to sue churches for money. Like, we don't want
right.
money. We want our abuser's name on record. We want it filed in the courthouse
Yep.
so that we know that our story matters.
Yes.
We want to know that this person who did this to us, even if they're dead, we want their name to be set in stone in the courthouse to know that
Yes.
we got some form of justice.
Yes.
They
I
want
totally
validation. They don't want money.
correct. Exactly the same thing here. And for that, what's really so beautiful is we're already seeing a lot of healing taking place, because them feeling heard, saying those names of the people that abused them.
Yes.
There's it's a release for them. It's someone finally believes me.
Yeah.
Someone's finally listening. My story matters. And that has really been, I think, the silver lining in all of this, is seeing them have that transformation.
Yeah.
And that evolution, and seeing them empowered, and some of them have gone back to school and taking their lives back. It's like, makes it all worth it.
Yeah, for
Totally
sure.
makes it all worth it. Oh, and let me dovetail back when you originally said what makes this different this time around from the other people or the 90s with these stories. I think the legal team is what makes it different. Because before, people have tried to bring lawsuits or talked about it, but they get squashed or bullied or scared off. And quite frankly, they just don't have the money to do it.
Right.
So they have to slink away and try to just go rebuild their lives, feeling like no one listened to them or that they lost again. Right. This time we have a legal team that will not stop until justice is served.
Yeah, I think that's a great point.
Yeah.
I think a lot of survivors have learned the hard way that there is such a thing, even non-survivor, even people who support survivors, and they're like, well, I'm going to go in and I'm going to fight for you. You know, we're going to go in and we're going to keep hitting them until they admit that what they did was wrong. And I think what so many people have found out, that there is such a thing as reaching a point of exhaustion, because these churches, these organizations will not stop. They don't stop. They don't give up. They don't quit. And eventually you get so deflated and so exhausted and so financially worn down from missing days of work, or, you know, whatever, you know, that you're like, you know what, at this point, I don't have the time, energy, or money to keep fighting this. So yeah, you're right. I think that's great when you have a law firm that, you know, group of attorneys that they're not going to back down because they're doing their job.
Right. And we've had other attorneys offer to come in and help us pro bono as well. So there's definitely, like I said, I feel like God himself is leading this charge.
Yeah.
Because the people that have shown up to help, that feel like enough. We have to send a message, right? We have to send a message that failure to report will get you in trouble.
Yes.
And that's the other thing I hope to change, is that type of legislature or that type of precedence, There's been some, like with the Southern Baptists. Mormon Church. Did you see that article that a woman in Riverside, California, won the biggest sexual assault award in history
I did see
against the
that.
Mormon Church?
Yeah.
$1.6 billion.
That's kind of
Now,
similar
not
to,
that
yeah,
she'll get
similar
that.
to the Boy Scouts of America. Same thing, you know,
Right.
massive lawsuit that was won.
Massive.
Yeah.
So that's another way just to keep marching forward, to just keep reminding these predators, right? And whether it's the predator or the clergy that covers it up, or the other members of the congregation that help cover it up for their reputations, it's sending that message that obviously this is not okay, but you are playing with fire.
For
and
sure.
There's consequences here. So allowing the ICOC and the ICC with KIP to see and feel those consequences, I think that is the best way to help it stop, right? Because they got to feel it.
Yeah.
They have to understand that we see you. The whole world is watching, and you can no longer get away with this.
Yeah. Well, that's a good lead into another question. I wrote down a question. What do you think it would take to get church organizations to stop protecting abusers within their ranks? Because part of the premise for that question is, I still see churches doing it equally as much. Even we had the Pennsylvania grand jury report, right? Bombshell report that sent shockwaves and started investigations in all these different states. It went all the way to the Vatican, you know?
Wow.
This was massive, that started right here in my backyard in Cambria County. We interviewed Sean Doherty. He was the first victim to come forward and launched one grand jury investigation into the Altoona Johnstown diocese. Well, then all these survivors from across Pennsylvania were like, well, that's great about Altoona Johnstown, but what about our diocese? You know? And so that's what launched the statewide grand jury investigation of 2018. And then that went all over the country. You had the Houston Chronicle did all these reports into the Southern Baptist Church, into the Independent Fundamental Baptist Church. I mean, bombshell stories. And like basically everybody was caught with their pants down. And you would think at that point that churches would start to hit the panic button, be like, oh crap, like we probably shouldn't be covering up abuse. But I haven't seen that happen yet. Do you think that we're going to reach a point where organizations are like, man, we better wake up? Or do you think that that's not going to happen until they're personally affected, till they have that kind of jab in the heart?
I think it's twofold. I think they have to continue to be personally affected, like with what we're doing with our lawsuits. We're naming the church, right? Of course, the ICOC entity. We're naming the group that it happened in, whether it be San Antonio or Florida, or there's one called North River Church of Christ in Georgia. So we're naming them to help hold their feet to the fire if that was where the abuse happened, because the whole leadership always knew, right, what was happening. So I think we have to continue to hold their feet to the fire, and the lawsuits have to keep coming. That's the only way to do it. Do I think they'll ever stop trying to hide it? No. Unfortunately, I think people will try to get away with whatever they can until the end of time. Right?
I agree.
And that's the problem with humanity. We're flesh. There's going to be perpetrators. There's going to be pedophiles, right? But as a community, as a village, we have to continue to hold their feet to the fire. And the members, and that's what I'm trying with some of these ICOC members. I'm trying to help some of the current members that I'm friends with and in communication with to hold their feet to the fire.
Sure.
And to let them know that don't be complicit in this. Don't be afraid. Don't be fearful. Hold their feet to the fire. Because if we're doing it collectively, the goal is at least it will happen less.
Yes.
At least it won't be so shoved under the rug and at least it will be find outable, right? Like at
Yeah.
least there's easier ways to get in there to go, what's going on here?
Yeah.
And not so stealthy of
Yeah.
a cover up. That's my goal, is to make things more easy to address.
Yeah.
The things that need to be addressed, I believe, will always be happening
I
again,
agree.
because there's a sickness in, you know, there is
Yeah.
that sickness. But you know, we can do our part while we are on this planet to make sure it happens as little as possible, and that's my goal.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me of I mean, it's not the same thing at all, but it reminds me when Jesus said, the poor you will always have among you. You know, like nobody's going to eradicate poverty.
Yeah.
Like we're not going to wipe it out
Right.
ever.
Right.
You're just not. Like there's always going to
Right.
be poverty. There's always going to be starvation. There's always going to be abuse. There are always going to be cover-ups. We're not going to get rid of that in the church. I agree wholeheartedly.
Right.
But yeah, we can certainly minimize and let people know if you're covering up abuse, as an
Yeah.
organization or as an individual, there are pretty severe consequences when you get caught. You
Exactly.
know, you may be able to
Exactly.
hide it for 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, but eventually you're just, there
Yes.
are going to be consequences and it's going to hurt.
Right. And it's exactly. And that's why we have to do this. It's not even a should we or can we, it's we have to.
Yeah.
How do you not?
Yeah.
How do you not?
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I agree. So why do you think people stay in abusive organizations like this? Even when they know there's rampant abuse, and I see this all the time, like not just survivors, it makes more sense to me because you're so conditioned, like you said, you're so beaten down and conditioned, but I see a radical defense of abusers almost always. Like that's usually the first response from lay people in the congregation. It's like, well, how dare you, talk about this man and try to ruin his reputation.
Right.
And you're just spreading gossip, like,
right.
Why do you think people stay in organizations like that? Can they just not see it, or do they not want to see it?
Well, several reasons. I think the main reason is what you just said. The main reason is they don't want to see it because it's too hard to reconcile everything that they've given and done for this group, that type of thing has been happening behind the scenes or been hidden from them. I think that's a reckoning in their own mind that is very hard for most humans. I think that that's sad. I really do. But it's a fact.
Yeah.
That it's too hard for them. I think because with how our brain works, and once those neural pathways are blazed, right, from point A to point B, here's what I believe. It's very hard to adjust course and believe something different. And I'm not even talking spiritually or biblically, but there's so much indoctrination that goes on inside of a group like the ICOC or the ICC, that indoctrination is so thick that if I'm not a part of this group, am I even saved? Right? Because we're the only ones that view baptism correctly. And if you've believed that since a teen or most of your adult life, or even for several years, I think it's really hard to blaze new trails of neural pathways in your brain. Like that in itself. Yeah.
I've heard this expression often talking about our tribe. If I step off of this ship, where do I go? I walk into the water. It, like, not even thinking, well, there are other ships out there on the sea with you. Like this ain't the only boat.
It ain't the only boat. And here's the thing. When I was inside of the ICOC, of course, I thought that as well. I was on the full-time staff. But once I was so abused enough to where I went, I don't care if I drown when I get off this boat. At least it's better than the daily torture, right?
Yeah.
So But once I got out there, I realized that God was so much bigger than that boat.
Yeah.
So much bigger in every cell of my body, in every little, plant or insect. I started to see God everywhere and not just on the ICOC premises.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like, God really is everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
And I learned to love God in a way and hear him and see him that was so much bigger and more encompassing than the statistics of the ICOC,
Mm-hmm.
right? Or
Right.
what they taught in that very cyclically abusive and enclosed system.
Yeah.
It's a closed circuit society there, right? So I think unless someone is going to be really brave enough or strong enough to step out there and see that God is their biggest cheerleader and that they'll be fine, right? And whatever group or tribe they find to be a community in will be shockingly glorious for them.
Mm-hmm.
If they're not willing to step out there, they'll never be able to find that out. And that's the part that makes me sad,
Yeah.
because they're living very small, enclosed lives, even spiritually. God
Yeah.
is just so much bigger, evidenced by how my life blossomed when I got out of that group.
I hear that a
Like,
lot from people.
yeah,
When they break away from certain churches, denominations, whatever, that seems to be a common thread, is like
right.
we thought we would shrivel up spiritually, and they're like, we thrived. And
Thrive.
it kind of reminds me of Steve Harvey. Like, he talks about, he uses a couple of analogies, but he said, if you put a flea inside a jar, it knows how to jump, right? It can jump whatever, 3 feet, 4 feet in the air. But if you put a lid on that, it's going to jump up, hit the lid, and come back down. Well, it's going to get conditioned to that. Then if you pull the lid off, take it out of the jar, it'll never jump more than that high for the rest of its life.
Wow.
And I was like, that's a good analogy, because
It's a great analogy.
we are, right? We're so conditioned in our own tribes and denominations. We're taught that this is the way forward. Like, this is the New Testament church, right?
Yeah.
This is the church that that was founded on Christ, and all the others are knockoffs, kind of thing. And I think
Right.
a lot of denominations do that, where they kind of ingrain that in people to really keep people entrapped.
Right. Well, that's why the ICOC, when I was in it, they don't want you around your family a lot. Vacations were very short and monitored. You had to call your discipler every day when you're on vacation, because they think you'll wake up.
Yeah.
Like the analogy you just gave, you're out of the jar, like the flea, for 7 days.
And you don't know that you're capable of jumping 4 feet. Yeah. Right.
Right. Exactly. Well, I used my time in the ICOC. What helped me mentally was to look at it like I was in a cocoon for those years, because otherwise it was too hard to think about all those years I lost in there where I wasn't thriving and I was so miserable. So if I look at it like a cocoon of metamorphosis, once I got out, I broke out of that cocoon and could fly and had these big, beautiful butterfly wings now. Right. So I had to make that time mean something to me in the ICOC, or it just felt like prison.
Yeah.
So I turned that prison into not a coffin, into a cocoon. And now I just get to fly. And that's really my hope for other people when they get out, because some have been leaving and calling me, that they can realize that now they've got these big butterfly wings, that they're free to fly and live whatever life they want to live,
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. Well, we have a few minutes here. And then I got to go pick up little ones at a bus stop.
Yes.
So you are Jane Doe 1, as you mentioned in the lawsuits. But why did you originally not even consider yourself a survivor of sexual abuse within the ICOC? And why was it so hard for all those years to talk about it?
Well, like I think I explained in the beginning about why I didn't even, because it wasn't a member
Right.
that abused me,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, and by the way, after the assault, he fled and disappeared, never to be seen again,
Hmm.
which I was happy about, actually. But that played into that narrative in my head too, that it wasn't, when all these stories first started to come out, I never even in my mind thought that this happened to me like inside the ICOC, because at the time I was I wasn't on premises, I was in my own
Right.
apartment, right? And so
Mm-hmm.
again, Senator Joe Dunn, he was like, Shell, you have latent indoctrination in your head.
Mm-hmm.
They were advising you to do this to recruit people for their organization. Clearly, this is part of the case. And it was like the scales fell from my eyes.
Yeah.
Which and it's in itself was very healing for me. It helped me kind of put context, and it helped clear up things in my own mind of the things that I was still blaming myself for,
Mm-hmm.
and allowed me to release a lot of that, I think, guilt and shame, and even thinking about why I handled that the way I did. Now, of course, I see it clearly and would do it all differently, but when you're still indoctrinated, you're not seeing that
Yeah.
clearly. Yeah,
For sure.
exactly.
Yeah, it
So
makes sense.
I don't know. So hopefully that answers.
It does. Yeah. And I think that's probably a message we can leave survivors with is getting over that guilt. And I don't even like using that term because it's not your guilt to carry. Like
Correct.
the fact that you didn't speak up right away, the fact that you felt like, well, this wasn't, this was an individual who did this to me, and this had nothing to do with the ICOC. Like that's not your guilt to carry.
Right.
And so I hope survivors can realize a lot of what stops them from speaking up is that guilt and shame that's been placed on them, very intentionally, by the way.
Oh,
To keep
very
people,
intentionally.
yeah, and it's to keep people
Strategically.
under their thumb, to keep them under the rule of the leadership, to keep them in the church without leaving. Like, I've experienced it too, where I see like people are so shamed when they leave an individual congregation, as if like that's the only congregation that's going to get you to heaven. And I'm like, well, maybe it just wasn't a great fit for them. Maybe they're going to thrive somewhere else. And shouldn't we bless them and encourage them to go somewhere where spiritually they're going to thrive and do well?
Such a great point. And I have to add to that really quick. I know you have to go, but that's another explanation why some people don't leave the ICOC. Because some people spiritually think they need that accountability and those boundaries.
Mm-hmm.
They don't trust themselves outside of that group, that tribe. They think, who will tell me what to do? Where's my community? Where will I get my advice from? Where? So I know they have a lot of friends in the group, and that's another reason they don't want to leave. I get that. But some people spiritually have a really hard time being on their own journey.
Yeah.
To seek and find God. They need to be told. They need to have those guardrails. And it's interesting because I've had a lot of those conversations about here. They're like, Shell, we see the abuse, but my husband and I can't leave because we need that support.
Yeah.
And they don't think they'll get the spiritual support anywhere else, which is false.
Oh,
that
absolutely.
That is not true.
Right.
But they've been trained to think that way. You will drown without us. What shall you do?
Which is a form of spiritual abuse. Right?
Completely.
Yeah. I mean, it's like a parent who keeps their kid locked up in the house till they're 65 years old, and they're like, you'll never be able to make it out there in that world by yourself.
It's scary
like
out there.
It's scary out there, and that world will eat you alive.
Exactly.
We're here to protect you.
Right?
But Dad, I'm 65 years old. I know, son.
That's
you know what I mean?
Analogy. You can't keep your training wheels on your bike, your whole life. At some point, you got to take them off and go, I can ride this bike.
Yeah,
I
for
can do it.
sure.
I can figure it out. I can navigate. Yeah. So
Yeah, I
yeah.
highlight a lot with our listeners. I call them the outcasts, but the people who are rejected by the religious community and
Mm,
who begged Jesus to follow him. They're like,
yeah.
please, we'll follow you anywhere. And his answer is, no, go home, go in peace. And I'm like, isn't
Mm,
that interesting? He doesn't like tell them, all right, you need to go to the synagogue on, 32nd and Balm Street. And, you need to get plugged into that synagogue because they'll be able to really help you on your spiritual journey. He doesn't say that. Instead, Jesus is like,
right.
no, go home, go in peace. And they're literally begging to follow him. I think he had a
Wow.
lot of discernment, because other places there are people who he's like, if you don't follow me, you can't be my disciple. Like he had that inherent natural ability to see people who he needed to send on their way for them to go heal. And he's like,
Right.
the synagogue is not like, I'm not calling you to the synagogue. I'm calling you to
Right.
go home and be with your family,
Right.
And I think it's so
That is
powerful.
such a
And
great point. I'd never thought about it that way, actually. Like he
yeah.
had that discernment to know who needed to just personally go heal and have that time.
Yeah, the
And
woman,
those that,
the prostitute who's grinding her hair into his feet in Luke 7, Like I love
yeah,
that story because not only does he say your sins are forgiven, but then he tells her, like, I think the most powerful part of that whole story, he says, go in peace. And he
mm,
literally sends her home. And I'm like, how cool is that? Like he didn't say, well, now you got to get plugged into a Bible study and, synagogue is, church service. That's the only way. But we're ingrained to tell people that, right? We're
yeah,
so conditioned to tell people that apart from the physical church,
yeah,
like you will have no spiritual nourishment
right.
whatsoever.
Whatsoever.
And it goes back to what you were saying, like God is so much bigger. And
So much bigger.
in the
Yeah,
community, like the church is so wide and so vibrant and so full of people in the least likely places. And I love it, you know?
yeah.
I love seeing that.
I love that too. Wow. Well, you know, the ICOC, they will cease to exist though if they hold to that biblical standard.
Sure.
It would allow people, I think, to wake up and look elsewhere. So they can't
Yeah.
hold to that biblical standard, which is very sad.
Yeah.
Well, and what the ICOC would do and the ICC with Kip, like the example you gave with the prostitute, I don't think they'd say, go home, go in peace. They'd say, and where's your tithe?
Yeah,
Right?
that's
Like,
right.
you're
Give us
making
your
money,
tithe, and then
lady.
we'll disciple you. And
Right. And what's your commitment for your tithe money? It's
yeah.
just maddening.
Yeah.
So maddening. So, well, the one of the monikers that people are spreading online, and I'd like to leave you with as well, is that with the lawsuits, prosecution does not equal persecution.
Right.
And that's kind of the
Yes.
thing they're screaming is persecution, and that we are Satan's workers and we're trying to destroy the church. No, we're not.
Nope.
We're just trying to get you guys to stop covering up abuse. It's pretty simple.
Yeah.
And in order to do that, we've had to bring lawsuits because you won't listen. And people have tried for about 40 years. You keep doing it, you keep covering it up. So here we are. We're not
Yep.
persecuting you, but we are prosecuting you.
Yeah. Yeah.
Quite a
That's a
big
great
difference.
distinction. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Very big difference.
Yep.
Important difference.
Yes, exactly.
Well, Chele Roland, thank you again. The podcast and YouTube channel is WhaTheFlok. I love that title. We will link to that in the description here, whatheflok.com. A suggested book that you suggested is The Body Keeps a Score. That's a great read.
Yeah.
And then Instagram is free to be. FREE.
That's our new nonprofit for survivors.
Okay,
Yes.
great. Fantastic. We'll link to all that in the description. And
Excellent.
Chele, thank you so much for being with us.
Well, thank you. And I feel like I have a new friend, Jimmy. So
yeah, likewise.
you have my heart. You've restored, I think, my appreciation for ministers, just so you know.
Awesome.
And if I was in your neighborhood, I would even go to your church.
Right
That's
on.
how much you've restored. And that says a lot. Let me tell you, anyone that knows me, that says a lot.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, Chele,
Yes.
thank you so much. It's been an honor, and I know this will help a lot of people.
Likewise.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Jimmy. Talk to you later.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Bye.
Thanks again for listening to today's episode. A special thank you to our patrons who make this podcast possible. Please help us get the word out by searching for the Speaking Out on Sex Abuse podcast in your favorite podcast app. Be sure to hit subscribe and rate the show. Please consider supporting the podcast by becoming a patron and check out the rewards our patrons receive.